And so before we get started on today's webinar, I just have a couple of quick announcements. One is that you are all in listen only mode just to cut down on some of the background noise and minimize the distractions for the interpreters. I will leave time for questions at the end. Once I get through the PowerPoint, I'll ask that you put those in the chat box and I'll read them aloud for everybody's benefit. A second announcement is that CRC credits are available for your participation today. If that's something that you require, you can shoot me an email after the webinar is over. I'll make sure that those get logged in for you. My email address is on the very last slide, and I also put it in the chat box. And folks are coming into the waiting room. Just give me a minute. Just give those folks a minute to join. Lastly, this training is going to be recorded and archived for the benefit of those that couldn't join us today. I'm going to go ahead and have this put up on the DARS YouTube channel after the training, so you can go back to listen to it at your convenience as you want to. So today's training is going to be on SSI and SSDI overpayments. And for those of you who were expecting a webinar on Plan for Achieving Self-Support or PASS, I did send an email about this also, but just wanted to follow up that I decided to switch it up a little bit and do a webinar on overpayments instead, because I've gotten a lot of questions both from work incentive specialist advocates and VR counselors alike lately on how to assist a client in addressing overpayments. So I decided that a webinar on overpayments might be a little bit more beneficial right now than one on PASS. I will have a webinar scheduled on PASS at a later date, probably early 2023. Okay, and I'm just admitting folks as they come in. Just give me one moment. Okay, so again, today's webinar is going to be on SSI and SSDI overpayments. And we're going to talk about a couple of different things today. First of all, we'll just briefly cover what an overpayment is and what the common causes of overpayments are. There's three of them that are the main causes. And we'll also talk about ways that you as the counselor can assist your clients in addressing those overpayment notices as they get them, including how you can utilize a work incentives specialist advocate or WISA to help a client address an overpayment as a billable WISA service. And then we'll talk lastly about the options that clients have for reporting wages and notifying Social Security that they're working, because wage reporting is the most common way to help a client avoid an overpayment. So we'll just go through some of the different options for wage reporting and how you guys as the counselors can help a client understand when and how they need to report wages to Social Security as they work. So very briefly, what is an overpayment? And an overpayment is simply when Social Security pays a beneficiary either more in Social Security disability insurance, SSDI, or supplemental security income, SSI benefits than they're due for the month. When a client is overpaid, they will be notified by Social Security in writing. And the overpayment notice will say a couple of things. And if you have been counselor for a long time, you've probably seen these notices, but right at the top, it'll say notice of overpayment. It'll tell them how much they owe in benefits, the period for which they owe that money, and why they were overpaid. So for example, a client could get an overpayment notice that says, we determined that you were overpaid in supplemental security income or SSI of $5,000 for the period of, let's say, June to December of 2022. And the reason why you were overpaid is because you had wages and we didn't know that you were working. I don't have an example of an overpayment letter handy, but that's basically what the overpayment letter consists of. It'll say how much the client owes, the period for which they owe it, and why they were overpaid. And the reason why it's so important to understand how to address overpayments is because when clients get these overpayment notices, it causes a lot of anxiety and fear. Because what clients don't always understand is that the overpayment letters are standard form letters, and other than filling in the dates and the amount that the client owes, all the overpayment letters will say the same thing. So it might say something like, we've determined that you owe us $5,000 due to your work activity, and you should write us a check and send it in the enclosed envelope within 30 days for the whole amount. Okay, so it doesn't matter if a client owes $200, $2,000, or $20,000. Regardless of what they owe, there's going to be that passage in there that says you owe us X amount of dollars. You should write us a check within 30 days and return it to us in the enclosed envelope. So obviously, the first thing that the client is going to do is panic, say, yeah, I can't afford $20,000 or whatever it is that they owe to return within 30 days. And their first inclination is to quit their jobs because they fear, and there's somebody coming into the waiting room, just 1 second. The client's first inclination when they get that overpayment letter is to quit their job because they fear if they continue to work, they're just going to receive additional overpayments. So understanding as the counselor what the client's rights are in terms of appealing an overpayment determination is essential in helping them understand that they don't always necessarily have to pay the overpayment back or all at once. They do have options to address that overpayment over a period of time. And we'll talk a little bit about what those options are as we go through some of the slides. So what can cause an overpayment? As I said before, there are 3 common causes. And the most common one is a client is either they're working and they don't notify Social Security of that. So Social Security has no documentation that the client is working. They might be working on SSI, where Social Security is going to count a portion of their wages, or if they're on SSDI and earning over the substantial gainful activity threshold. This year is $1,350 gross per month. In January, that's going up to $1,470. But if somebody's on SSI and they're working and Social Security doesn't know that, or if they're on SSDI and those wages are over substantial gainful activity, there are going to be overpayments that happen if Social Security is not notified. Another common example of what can cause an overpayment is a client might report their wages, but Social Security doesn't process the wage reports timely. That happens a lot, where the client will either report the wages in person at the local office and not maybe get a receipt, or they'll send them in through the mail and Social Security doesn't always process them timely. So even if a client does report timely, that's not always processed on Social Security's end, and they end up getting overpaid anyway. Another example of how overpayment could be caused is a client could be eligible for a work incentive, and the client has either not requested that work incentive be applied to their record, or they have requested the work incentive applied to the record, but Social Security has not applied it correctly. And I'll go through some examples of some work incentives that can be used to reduce and eliminate overpayments in just a little bit when we get to the work incentive slides. But just keep in mind that these are the common causes of an overpayment. Okay, so ways to address an overpayment include the following, and we're going to go through each of these in detail, but this is just kind of a breakdown of the different options that are available. If a client disagrees with the fact that they were overpaid or the amount, they can file a request for reconsideration, which is a formal appeal with Social Security stating that they don't agree that they were overpaid. They can request a waiver of overpayment, either partial waiver or full, if they feel like they're not at fault in causing that overpayment, or they have the option to work out a reasonable payment arrangement with the Social Security Administration. Sometimes there could be a work incentive that applies to a client's record that they're not necessarily utilizing, that could reduce or eliminate an overpayment. And again, we'll talk about that in detail in a couple minutes. So the first option that a client has for adjusting an overpayment is called request for reconsideration. And this is a formal appeal with the Social Security Administration. And again, going back to what I said before, when a client is overpaid, Social Security is required to notify them in writing that they were overpaid, include the amount of the overpayment, the reason, and why they were overpaid. And part of that overpayment notice, and there's somebody coming in, just 1 second. Part of that overpayment notice, Social Security is required to tell folks what their options are in terms of appealing an overpayment that they don't agree with. So request for reconsideration is the first one. This is a formal appeal with SSA, and it must be requested within 65 days of the date on that overpayment notice. So whatever the date on that overpayment notice is, if a client wants to appeal that determination, they have to do it within 65 days of the date on the overpayment notice. If they want benefits to continue during the appeal, then that appeal has to be filed within 30 days. If a client appeals an overpayment within 30 days of that date on that overpayment notice, then Social Security is not going to withhold any benefits until they make a decision on the reconsideration or the appeal. Okay. So a request for reconsideration is not appropriate for every client that's been overpaid. Either the client disagrees with the fact that they were overpaid at all, or they disagree with the amount that Social Security says that they owe. Okay. So a request for reconsideration, in other words, a formal appeal, is only appropriate if a client either says, I don't agree with the fact that I was overpaid at all, I think Social Security is wrong, or I don't think I owe as much as what they say that I owe. Okay. So again, if a client requests that within 30 days of that notification, Social Security is not going to withhold any benefits during that appeal process until a decision is made on that claim. Another option is a request for waiver. And if you've been a counselor for a long time, you probably had folks who have come to you with questions about the waiver process. So requesting a waiver is appropriate when a client agrees that they were overpaid. Okay, so they're not disputing the fact that the overpayment exists, but what they're saying is that I don't feel like I was at fault in causing the overpayment and I can't afford to pay it back. Paying it back would cause me a financial hardship. Okay, so a client would have to meet both of those criteria in order to qualify for a waiver. So number one is without fault. Number two, they can't afford to repay. Now, if you have a client that's on SSI, supplemental security income, because SSI is a needs-based benefit, they're automatically deemed unable to repay that benefit based on the fact that they're getting a benefit based on economic need. Okay. So in other words, for lack of a better term, Social Security says, okay, we determine that you're too poor to pay the overpayment back. Okay. And there's somebody else coming in. Just 1 second. Okay, so again, if a client is on SSI, they're automatically deemed unable to repay. So if a client is on SSI and looking for a waiver, all they have to show then is they were without fault in causing the overpayment. And a good example of showing without fault would be the following. I always tell people that the best way to report wages is by certified mail. They should make a copy of all the pay stubs they send in and then send their report certified, because that way Social Security has to sign for it. And that receipt is the documentation that Social Security got that wage report through certified mail if they ever question it. So a way for a client to show without fault would be, well, I reported all my wages every month by certified mail. I've got copies of everything that I sent in to you, and here's the certified mail receipt showing that you got it. If a client keeps detailed records like that and accurate records like that, that could be an example of how they can show that they're without fault in causing the overpayment. Basically they're saying, well, I reported the wages to you, and it was up to you to document those changes and adjust my payments accordingly. Okay. So if a client is on SSDI though, in addition to showing without fault, they also have to show that they cannot afford to repay. So in a situation like that, if you look at the waiver form, and there's a link to the waiver form on one of the last slides, there's a section that's a financial statement. It'll go through asking the client to explain why they feel like they're not at fault. It'll ask whether or not they reported the wages, yes or no. And then there's a section at the very end that talks about finances. And if somebody's on SSDI, they're going to have to show that they cannot afford to repay the overpayment, or withholding of the benefit would be a hardship. And so Social Security may ask for things like proof of other income that the client has in addition to their SSDI benefits. They might ask them to submit proof of other living expenses, rent, mortgage, utilities, food. They're going to ask them to total up all their living expenses and submit documentation of what those expenses are. And often, if the client's expenses exceed the amount of income they have coming in every month and they're on SSDI, that would be an example of showing an inability to repay. Okay. So again, if they're on SSI, they don't have to do a financial statement. They're deemed unable to repay. If they're on SSDI, they do have to do that financial statement, and Social Security may ask for proof of living expenses that would be submitted with the copy of that waiver. For a waiver, unlike the request for reconsideration that has to be filed within 60 days, there is no time limit for filing a waiver. A client can file a waiver at any time they choose to, and that's true even if they have already started to repay that overpayment. They can request a waiver at any time. Next thing is a payment arrangement with Social Security. Okay. Now, this should only be done as a last resort. If a client wants to appeal an overpayment, if they feel like the amount is wrong, or if they don't feel like they're overpaid, they should appeal. If they feel like they're not at fault in causing the overpayment and can't afford to repay, then they should do a waiver. A payment arrangement is only a last resort if the client agrees that they're overpaid and they were at fault. And an example of that would be, I was working, I was receiving SSI and I didn't report my wages. Social Security didn't know that I was working. That could be an example of a client who would not be eligible for a waiver because the overpayment was their fault. So a payment arrangement can be made with Social Security if the client either agrees that they're overpaid and at fault. And this is particularly really important for cases where the client gets SSDI only, because by law, if somebody gets SSDI and they're found liable to repay an overpayment, Social Security can actually withhold the entire amount of that SSDI check every month until that overpayment is satisfied. Okay, so if you have a client who's on SSDI that gets an overpayment notice and they don't do anything about it, their benefits are going to start to be withheld probably within 60 days of the date on that letter. Okay. So if you have a client who was overpaid and they come to you in a panic and say, oh my gosh, I didn't get a benefit check this month, it could be because they did nothing to address the overpayment. Okay. So working out a suitable payment arrangement with Social Security would stop the Social Security Administration from withholding the entire benefit. Okay, so if they do get overpaid and they're on SSDI particularly, it's really important that they respond to that overpayment notice as soon as possible, either by filing an appeal, a waiver, or contacting Social Security about a payment arrangement. Because if not, they could be in some serious trouble when they don't receive a benefits check. If a client is on SSI it works a little bit differently. Because SSI is a needs-based benefit based on economic need, under the law, Social Security can't withhold more than 10% of the client's SSI benefit every month to repay that overpayment. Okay. So this month with 841, I believe it's $84 that Social Security can withhold from an SSI check. And that's the maximum amount of SSI that they can withhold every month to repay that overpayment. Okay. Now, if somebody's on SSI and they say, I can't afford to have 10% of my benefits withheld, they can also work out a payment arrangement with Social Security. Whereas I've seen some cases where Social Security will take as low as $10 or $20 a month to recoup that overpayment. Okay, so if withholding of the client's 10% of an SSI check is too much of a hardship for them, they can work out a payment arrangement with Social Security to withhold less. Payment arrangements must be requested in writing, and there's actually a link to the form that a client would use to request a payment arrangement with Social Security at the end of the presentation. And if we have time, I can pull it up and briefly go through it with you. And I just need a drink of water, one moment. So I talked a little bit about one of the causes of an overpayment being that a client might be eligible for a work incentive, but not be accessing it or utilizing it. There are certain work incentives, either that apply to an SSDI case, an SSI case, or sometimes both, that can either reduce or eliminate an overpayment because it reduces the amount of money that Social Security counts in determining whether or not a client is eligible for benefits in a month. Okay, so let's just talk about some of them briefly. And keep in mind that all these work incentives that we're going to be talking about can be applied retroactively. So if a client was eligible for a work incentive in a month where Social Security says, oh, you were overpaid, you're working, we didn't know about that, the client can go back to them and say, well, wait a minute, I have a work incentive that should have applied that didn't, so I don't owe you any money, or I don't owe you as much as you're saying that I owe. Okay, so utilizing these work incentives could be a way to address an overpayment. One of them is the student earned income exclusion, which applies to an SSI case only. And if you've been around for a while and you've been to some of my trainings, you probably remember that the SCIE, or student earned income exclusion, applies to folks who are on SSI, who are under the age of 22, and who are students. And Social Security's definition of student means that they're either in high school for at least 12 hours a week, they're in college for 8 hours a week, or they're in some sort of vocational training program for at least 15 hours a week to help prepare them for a job. So if you have a client who's on SSI, they're under age 22, meets that definition of a student, Social Security will disregard a certain amount of money every month from their countable income when determining their eligibility for SSI in that month, up to a maximum cap per year. Okay. So SCIE is a way to reduce or eliminate an overpayment because it reduces the amount of money that Social Security should have counted in the client's wages. So for example, you have a student who's on SSI, they come to you with an overpayment notice of $1,000 in SSI benefits, but you know that they were a student and they should qualify for that student earned income exclusion. A work incentive specialist advocate, or WISA, could help a client access that SCIE as a WISA billable service. And once that work incentive is applied to the client's record, it would wipe out the $1,000 overpayment that the client has. Okay. So another example of a work incentive that could apply in an overpayment case is a subsidy. And this one applies to folks that are on SSDI only. And going back to previous trainings, you probably remember that a subsidy applies when the person with a disability that's on SSDI is making the same amount of money that their colleagues are that don't have disabilities, but they have some sort of special accommodations in place. So for example, a subsidy could be something like a job coach that's paid for by DARS or another vendor. It could be something like they receive extra supervision on the job to make sure that they're performing all the duties of that job correctly. It could be something like they have different job duties or a little bit easier job duties than a client who doesn't have, or a coworker rather, that doesn't have a disability. All those things, whether DARS pays for it or it's a reasonable accommodation set up through an employer, could be counted as a subsidy. And Social Security has a process for determining how to figure out the amount of a subsidy, which I'm not going to get into right now. That's kind of a separate training. But if a client is eligible for a subsidy in the month, they're on SSDI and they get an overpayment notice, subsidy is another WISA billable service where the WISA could work with the client to get that subsidy requested in writing, submitted to the client's local Social Security office, and when applied retroactively, reduce the amount of money that Social Security should have counted in a month that they're saying the client is overpaid. So it's just another example of a way to help a client address an overpayment by applying that work incentive. Another one is impairment related work expenses, or IRWEs. This can be utilized by anybody who's either on SSI or SSDI, where the client has certain expenses that are related to their work, related to their disability. They pay for out of pocket, and they are not reimbursed for by any other source. So a common example I use, let's say a client has cerebral palsy, and even with vehicle modifications, they can't drive. So they take public transportation back and forth to work every month, every day. At the end of the month, they can submit receipts for that transportation to Social Security and say, well, I can't drive because of my disability. It's costing me X amount of dollars to get back and forth to work taking the bus. Social Security will take that amount that they're spending on that work incentive, from counting as income. So using IRWE that's work related, disability related, that the client pays for and is not reimbursed, could reduce or eliminate an overpayment as well by applying those kind of work incentives. Again, whether it be student earned income exclusion, subsidy, impairment related work expenses, these are all billable work incentive specialist advocate or WISA services. So if you have a client that's overpaid, but you think that there's a work incentive there that should have applied and didn't, you can consult a WISA to do a screening for any of these different work incentives. And if the client qualifies, then you could issue an authorization for the WISA to help a client request in writing that work incentive. And again, once those work incentives are applied to the record correctly, it often reduces or even eliminates an overpayment. I had a case one time. I can give you an example of how a subsidy works in this case. I had a client who was blind, and he was working in the kitchen at a restaurant. And his subsidy was that he had different job duties than his non-disabled colleagues. He was working in the kitchen, but because he had low vision, they didn't make him do the dishes. The dishes were done by a coworker. Even though he didn't do all the same job duties that his coworker did, they paid him the same amount of money. The employer did. Social Security came back to that client and said, well, we weren't aware that you were working and you owe us, I think it was something like almost $15,000. It was quite a bit of money. While in talking to the client and his wife, I found out that he did have different job duties than his non-disabled coworkers. He wasn't expected to perform all the functions of the job. That was a subsidy. I worked with him to get that requested with Social Security. And once they applied that, it was enough to put his earnings under that substantial gainful activity, or SGA, figure. And because he was no longer earning SGA after they took that subsidy off, that also wiped out the overpayment. So that's just an example of how that could work. Again, WISA services can help. If you have a client who needs assistance with addressing an overpayment, you can issue an authorization to the WISA using procedure code A3018 under the Work Incentives Budget and Aware. And the WISA can help a client address an overpayment in a couple different ways, either by helping them request reconsideration, requesting a waiver, or working out a payment arrangement with Social Security. So either one of those options would satisfy addressing an overpayment. And the WISA receives $250 per referral for every overpayment authorization that they receive. It used to be $150 and then went up to $250 as of October 1st, just FYI. Oops, jumped ahead a little bit. Just give me 1 second. Okay. So you as the counselor are looking for a couple different things when a WISA goes ahead and bills for an overpayment authorization they receive. So the WISA is required to produce documentation from Social Security to you as the counselor that the overpayment has been satisfied to be eligible for payment of the service. So in addition to getting an overpayment letter, if once a client either appeals a overpayment, request a waiver, or request a payment arrangement, Social Security is required to notify the client in writing whether or not the appeal, waiver, or payment arrangement has been approved. And if so, if that approval comes, the letter will state, we've decided to waive your overpayment. We've determined that you're without fault in causing the overpayment, and you don't have to pay us back. Okay? So what the WISA would submit to you for documentation of that payment is a copy of that letter saying that either the appeal, the waiver, or the payment arrangement was approved in order to be eligible for a payment of that service. And I see a raised hand. I will leave the time for questions at the end, so I'll get to you in just a second. So I wanted to talk a little bit about ways to avoid SSA overpayments. And the most common one is report, report, report. I can't emphasize that enough because, again, a lot of the time when there's an overpayment, it could be because the client's working and didn't notify Social Security of that. So reporting is the best way to help a client avoid those instances of overpayments. And we'll just go through a couple examples of how a client can do that. So just for FYI reference purposes, if you have a client who's on SSI, supplemental security income, they should report wages by the 6th of the month for the preceding month. Or if they're on SSDI, the 10th of every month for the preceding month. That would give Social Security sufficient time, you hope, to determine whether or not a client is eligible for a payment in a month based on their wages for a previous month. So for example, if somebody's on SSI, their wages generally impact their benefits 2 months later. So if somebody starts working on, let's say, January of 2023, they report that, the wages would impact their check for March. So there's a couple different options of ways that a client can report. Client can report in person at a local SSA office now. Offices were closed for a long time at the height of COVID. Things are finally starting to reopen again. So the client does have the option of reporting in person at a local SSA office. What I would suggest that folks do there is if they're going to report in person, still save copies of all the pay stubs they submitted and make sure they request a receipt from the Social Security representative that took the report. Social Security is automatically supposed to issue a receipt when a client reports. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes the client has to request one. So make sure that your client does request a receipt if they don't get one right away. Another option is by certified mail. Going back to what I said before, that's often a great way to document that a client reported. If they save copies of their pay stubs, they have a copy of that return receipt signed by Social Security, just proving that Social Security got it if they ever question it. That would be one way to show without fault if there's an overpayment that comes up. Or they can use their myssa.gov account. There's an option now where a client can report online. What they'll be able to do is log into their account, and there's an option, there's a reporting tab on the very top when they log into their account, where the client can put in their wages every week, every 2 weeks, every month, however they're paid, and then submit the wage report electronically. What'll happen is once they do that, they'll get a receipt showing that Social Security did receive the wage report, and they should save a copy of that receipt as documentation that they reported online if it's ever questioned. So if somebody's using their myssa.gov account, they don't necessarily have to keep their paper pay stubs. I suggest they do, just because it's a good idea to have a paper trail of everything that's submitted. But they will get a receipt when they report online, showing that they did report if it's ever questioned. If they're on SSI, there's a couple different options. There's a SSI wage reporting app that can be downloaded from either the Apple Store or the Google Play Store if a client has an Android phone. There's an SSI wage reporting line where they can, it's automated, where they could just call and punch in the amount of money they made for the month, and they will get a confirmation number once that report is made that they can use as proof of reporting if it's ever questioned. And the client can also sign up for monthly text and email alerts from Social Security if they're on SSI that remind them, hey, you said that you were working before, it's time to report your wages for the next month. Okay. So if a client forgets to report wages, they can sign up for automated reminders that, hey, don't forget to send us your pay stubs for this month. And I find that's a really helpful feature, just to give clients that little nudge to report. And it does help cut down on some of those overpayments. Okay. Let's see. These are just links to some important forms, the request for reconsideration, waiver, and payment arrangement. And I just wanted to take a couple minutes, since we have plenty of time, to maybe go through a couple of them and show you what they look like in case you haven't seen them before. So this takes you to Form SSA 561, which is the formal request for reconsideration. And if you click on the PDF link here under where it says SSA 561, that'll bring up the form that the client has to fill out and return to their local office. All right, so the very top is just very self-explanatory, the client's name, the claimant SSN, and the claim number. Usually the claim number is the same as the SSN, unless the client is getting benefits like on the record of a parent, which is separate. The issue being appealed. So this is where I was asking what type of benefits the client's receiving. Are they on SSI? Do they get SSDI, Social Security Disability? Whatever the case may be. Again, and then it says, I do not agree with the SSA's determination and request reconsideration. My reasons are, so if somebody was over appealing something like an overpayment, they would say something like, well, you said that I owe $10,000. I haven't been working that long. And according to my records, I only owe 5,000. That's just an example of what somebody would put there to request reconsideration on the amount that Social Security says that they owe. Okay. If somebody's on SSI, they can choose to do a case review where Social Security will just look at the evidence they have in the client's file to determine whether or not they can approve the reconsideration request just based on the evidence. That could be an example where they go back and look at the file and say, okay, we do see wages here, and the overpayment isn't what we thought it was. It's not as much as we thought it was. Okay. They also have an option of doing an informal conference or a formal conference. An informal conference would give the client the ability to actually meet with the representative that's making a decision on the reconsideration, and the client can actually talk to them one-on-one and explain why they feel like the determination is wrong. So either they can do a case review and a reconsideration case, or they can do a informal conference if they want to meet with Social Security one-on-one. And the last section is just the client's contact information. And then the bottom is for SSA use only. So you can see it's a very simple one-page form. There's instructions on the following pages about how to complete the form. And then that's really it. Let me close that out. I'll go back to the PowerPoint and pull up the waiver form. This one's a little bit more detailed. And again, this one should only be used if the client agrees that they were overpaid, but they disagree with the fact that they are at fault and they can't afford to pay it back. So the first section is just identifying information, client's name, social security number, claim number, and I'll ask, why are you requesting a waiver? Well, first of all, they ask, are you the overpaid person, or are you like a payee or a parent? It'll ask what type of benefits the client's getting. Are they on SSI, SSDI, or are they receiving other kind of benefits like benefits from the VA? It'll ask for the client to enter how much they owe. And again, that amount will be on the overpayment notice that they receive. And they ask about what, enter the amount that you feel like you can afford to pay or have withheld from your benefit every month. Again, that would apply if a client was going to work out a payment arrangement with Social Security. And documents to support your statements. And again, just going back to what I said before, this is the financial statement part of the waiver that shows that the client can't afford to pay it back. If they're on SSI again, they don't have to fill out this part. This only applies if somebody is not on a needs-based benefit like SSDI. So you'll see here that they're going to ask for things like your current rent or mortgage information, utility bills, medical bills, and then they're going to ask for things that the client has on hand, like cash on hand in the bank. So they're going to ask the client to submit things like rent or mortgage information, bank statements to show how much money they have on hand. If they're working, they're going to ask for things like current pay stubs, anything that can show what their income and expenses are for the month. Social Security is going to ask the client to submit those as supporting documentation. They can't afford to pay the overpayment back. Okay. It's also going to ask for things like assets. So this is where the client would list anything like a checking account, savings account with either a bank or credit union. It'll ask about vehicles. And the reason why they ask about vehicles is because if somebody's not on a needs-based benefit where they're deemed and able to repay, Social Security is going to say, well, hey, do you have anything that you could sell or convert to cash that would help you pay the overpayment? So, if a client only has one car and its main use is to get them back and forth to work, odds are that Social Security is not going to, consider that vehicle as an asset they could sell to repay. That would only be if they had multiple vehicles or something they could sell or to convert to cash to pay for an overpayment. A lot of our clients, as you know, aren't in a position to have a lot of personal property that they can sell or convert to cash. But it's a question that they ask anyway. A lot of our people are on either SSI or they're barely making it on DI, and a lot of this isn't going to apply. But keep in mind that Social Security may ask those kind of questions when considering inability to repay. Real estate, yes or no, or you have any interest in business property or other valuables that you can convert to cash. Again, probably not going to apply to a lot of our folks, but it's a question that they ask. And then the next section is just a breakdown of monthly expenses. And I'm not going to take the time to go through them all. You have the link to the waiver form on the PowerPoint if you want to go through it. But they ask for basic living expenses, clothing, utility bills. How much are you spending on items X, Y, and Z every month? And then they're going to ask the client to total them up. And again, one of the ways that a client could show inability to repay if they're on SSDI is that their expenses exceed their income. That would be an example of a hardship to repay. Okay. And then there's a space for remarks at the very end that would just give the client a chance to inform Social Security of anything that's not already stated on the form. And then they would just sign it, dated at the end with their contact information. Okay, so that's the waiver form. And I just wanted to take a couple more minutes before I open it up for questions to go through the last one, is the payment arrangement form. Okay. And again, this one would be used if a client agrees the fact that they were overpaid and at fault, but paying the overpayment in full all at once would be a hardship. They would use this form to request that Social Security lower the amount that's withheld from their benefits. This form would be used either by a person on SSDI or SSI. Again, if somebody's on SSI, Social Security by law can't withhold more than 10%. But if the client wants to request that Social Security withhold less, maybe they want to pay back $10 or $20 a month, they would use this form to do that, to request that. So first section is obviously just the client's identifying information. Again, similar to the waiver, it'll ask whether the client is receiving SSDI, VA benefits, Social Security disability, etc. Enter the amount that you owe and enter the amount that you can afford to pay back or have withheld from your benefit each month. Okay, so if somebody was on, let's say, SSI and they couldn't afford to have 10% of their benefits withheld, that would be where they would put, I can afford to have, let's say, I'll pay back $20 a month. They would put that on line 4 there. Okay. And similar to the waiver, if somebody's on SSDI, in order to work out a payment arrangement where they're not going to withhold all the benefits, Social Security is going to ask them to complete a financial statement. And if you take the time to go through this, you'll notice that it's very similar, if not exactly the same as all the questions they ask on the waiver form. They're going to ask for information about monthly expenses, the value of any checking or savings accounts that the client might have on hand. They'll ask for, vehicles, property that they own that they could sell, convert to cash, et cetera, et cetera. It'll ask for monthly household income. Are you working, yes or no? And how often are you paid? Okay. It'll ask for the employer's name and contact information there. Take home, and then it'll ask the client to document their take-home pay and any other benefits that they receive. And then they would sign it and date it at the bottom once they put in the information about their monthly expenses. And again, this would probably only apply if a client was on SSDI. If somebody's on SSI, the maximum amount of money that they have this year is $841. That's going up to $914 in January. Still not a lot of money. So if somebody's income is SSI, Social Security is not going to make them go through the whole financial statement because they realize that it's going to be a hardship for them to pay it back. So if somebody says, yeah, I'm overpaid, but I can only afford $10 a month, Social Security will likely take that and not make them fill out the whole financial statement, but they will have to make a request in writing that they can afford to pay, only $10 a month. So in a case like that, the person on SSI would only fill out the first couple pages, and they would stop with, I'm receiving SSI and I can afford to pay $10 a month. Okay. The financial statement probably wouldn't apply in an SSI case just because the benefits are so low and based on need. This looks like somebody's coming into the waiting room late. Just 1 second, let me admit them. And just to reiterate, for the people that have come in late, I know that there have been a couple people coming into the waiting room as I was going through the PowerPoint. Again, this is going to be recorded in archive. So if you missed anything, it will be put up on the DARS YouTube channel. What I'll do is send the archive link out to all the district managers to distribute for me. So you can go back and listen to this later if you missed something. And then, very simply, it'll ask for the comparison of how much income the client has versus how much in expenditures they have going out every month. And if the expenditures are greater than the income they have coming in, that could be a good indicator that the person would need to work out a payment arrangement with Social Security, especially if they're an SSDI and they can't afford to have all their benefits withheld. If they can't meet all their bills without their SSDI check, that's an indicator that Social Security would likely work out a suitable payment arrangement with them. And in an SSDI case, of course, it's going to depend on how much the client owes. But I've seen cases where they withhold, as little as $50 a month in an SSDI benefit. But again, I can't reinforce enough, even though I've said this already. If you have a client that's on SSDI and they get an overpayment letter, they need to address it right away, either by requesting an appeal or doing a payment arrangement, because if they don't, within 60 days of getting that letter, they're not going to get any benefits. And then they're going to come to you as the counselor in a panic. So, always encourage your clients that you're working with, if something happens where they receive that overpayment letter, to bring it to you as quickly as possible so you can address it right away. And most likely you would address that by authorizing a WISA to help them with the overpayment. But make sure that they, if they get a letter from Social Security, make sure they don't just toss it aside. I know that it happens a lot where clients are kind of afraid of what the letter says. I've had clients who have done that too, where they see Social Security on the envelope and they just toss it aside. They're afraid to open the notice and they just don't do anything with it. But if a client gets a letter, please just always encourage your clients to open the letters right away. And if it's something like an overpayment or something that's going to change their benefits, if they don't do anything about it, encourage them to bring those letters to you right away. Okay. And that is it for that. Last slide is just my contact information. A big part of my job is to do technical assistance for y'all as the VR counselors and trainings like this. So if at any time you have anything that comes up related to not just overpayments, but anything related to SSI benefits, SSDI benefits, work incentives, questions about WISA billable services, things like that, you are free to reach out to me at any time. So my contact information is just on the last slide there. Now, I have been talking for just about an hour now. I wanted to take the last half hour or so for questions, and I know that there is a raised hand. And Vincent, because of the way that we set this up, I don't think that I can unmute you. I think you're in listen only mode. So if you could just type your question into the chat box, I would be more than glad to answer that. Okay, and there's a couple other questions in the chat box also. This one is from Donna Martin. She says, Hey, Mike, certified mail was $4. Is it still that? Is there any way working? Well, let me do that again. I'm sorry, it's early, everyone. She says, certified mail was $4. Is it still that? Is that in a way a work expense or just a necessary cost is best practice? No, Donna, that wouldn't be a work expense, but it is best practice in terms of documenting a wage report. And again, just to have that receipt signed by Social Security that documents that they got it, that's going to save the client a lot of hassle in the long run when it shows to proving they're not at fault in causing that overpayment. It's well worth the $4 to invest to have that security of knowing they have a paper trail. So okay, and I will give you all a little bit more time to type in your questions. And if you don't want to type them into the chat box, if you want to call me or email me, you can do that too. I mean, that's fine. But we do have plenty of time for questions. I'll give you all a few more minutes to type. Okay, I'm not seeing anything coming in the chat box yet. So either the presentation was thorough and everybody gets it, or I've thoroughly confused you. So if there's anything that you do need clarification on, feel free to ask, or you can contact me separately. If I'm not seeing anything in the chat, I can let you go a little bit early today. But again, you can follow up with me as needed if a question comes up. And Vincent says, Mike, I will email you my question. That's fine. I'll get back to you as soon as I can on that. Okay. There is a comment in the chat box. Donna says, oh, there's a couple of them. Jennifer says, these overpayment cases are very difficult. I worked with one that owed over 25K. I referred them to a WISA to help, but it was out of their wheelhouse. After filing 2 reconsiderations and 1 waiver, I ended up referring the person to the Disability Law Center of Virginia, who was amazing. I received a call from this client a few weeks ago saying they no longer owe an overpayment. Okay, well, that's, kind of disconcerting to me, honestly, Jen, that WISA told you that, because helping a client address an overpayment, either by filling out an appeal waiver payment form or helping them access applicable work incentives, those are all billable WISA services. So if maybe you want to contact me separately and let me know who that was that you were working with, it might be worth me following up with them to just make sure that they understand that those are services they can provide, because they shouldn't have told the client that they couldn't work that out. That should be an issue that the WISA should have handled. So we can address that separately though offline. Just send me that info if you would. Donna said, we have a young lady working 15 hours a week. She keeps getting overpayment notices. She set up a plan, but is frustrated by the letters. I told her to go visit the SSA office with her grandpa and see if they can explain why it's changing so much. Okay. Now, Donna, I think I might know who you're talking about here. I don't know if this is the same young lady that you've consulted with me on. But yeah, the best possible course of action in that case is to take copies of all the letters, make an appointment with the claims representative take a copy of all the letters that she's received from Social Security, along with any documentation that she has that she reported. Just bring everything that she's got to the claims rep, and they can kind of sort it out from there to make sure that no more letters come. Okay. And if there's anything that I can do to assist with that process, yeah, you can reach out to me too. If there's anything I can do to help, glad to do that. Okay. And Donna says, good. Yes, that's what I said. Yeah. And it's really helpful now. Now that the offices are open to the public again, for the clients to go sit down on one face to face with the claims rep and just go through everything. And COVID did cause an increased number of overpayments only because the offices were closed for such a long time. And many offices were, they had representatives working from home, and mail piled up, and things just weren't getting documented because, they were operating on skeleton crews in the offices. And so a lot of the overpayments that you're seeing now could be a result of Social Security didn't get to certain work actions because of COVID. Now that the offices are reopened and fully staffed, they're catching overpayments now that they should have caught, 6 months to a year ago. So you probably will see an increased a number of clients bringing you these overpayment notices because Social Security is catching up, and they're going to be saying, oh my gosh, what do I do? So that's why I thought, doing an overpayment webinar now would be kind of helpful. Okay. And there's another comment. The most frustrating overpayments we have seen that WISA struggle with are the ones that come from parents. The person is now 22 or older, but they owe from when their parents' income was affecting them. So yeah, on SSI under age 18, I don't see how the person is responsible when the parent was the one not reporting. You have heard me vent about this before, and we have been fighting this for a long time. And to me, obviously I'm not from Social Security, but I would think that if a client was on SSI prior to age 18 and there was a deeming issue and it was the parent's income, the parent didn't report, to me, that would be a strong case for a waiver. I would go ahead and fill out the waiver form and say, well, I'm not at fault here because it was up to my parents. I was a minor to report their income. They didn't do that. That has nothing to do with me. I didn't cause this. I can't guarantee that that would work, but I think it's a strong argument for why a client would not be at fault and qualify for a waiver. That's just my opinion. I would kind of advocate for that if it was my client, but yeah, but it is an issue. Yeah. And Adonis has agreed with is trying, and the worst they can say is no. If you have a client, you're not sure they would qualify for a waiver or they can show without fault. I mean, it doesn't hurt to request a waiver anyway. The worst SSA can say is no. Everything's worth a shot, especially in a case like that where it was a parent's issue. Any other questions, concerns, or comments? I'll give you just a minute or two more. And Donna, I'm glad you have a WISA that's willing to work on that case for your client. That's exactly what they should be doing. Yeah, Donna just says fingers crossed. It's been a long one. Yeah, it's a process for sure. Okay. I'm not seeing any last questions, comments, or concerns, so I will let you go a little early again. You can follow up with me offline if there is a pressing question or issue that didn't get addressed here. And I want to thank you all for joining me today and taking the time to participate. And again, just a reminder that if you need CRCs, just shoot me an email and I'll be glad to make sure that those get logged in for you. Okay. And Kate just says, thanks, good info. And Steven says, thank you to the interpreters. Yes, thank you so much to our interpreters and our captioner, Monica, for being here today. We greatly appreciate you. Okay, take care, everybody. Thanks for joining today. And the link for the webinar will be coming out shortly for the archive. Have a great day, everyone.